Do.
I don't know if we have any actual instances of people successfully doing it with the terminology service. I don't know, Larry, you might have some experience just with the sandbox work, but
Well, as you might guess, the terminology service mainly is focused on clinical codes and so forth. And I don't at least have any experience with facility registry trying to normalize all the different things that might be needed there. So.
So yeah, in that sense, you basically externalize all the issues of maintaining the data dictionary itself. You kind of wash your hands and you say, well, there's a group called ICD, and they gave us a dictionary. It's called ICD-9 or ICD-10, and that's the name of it. And whenever you say this is our ICD-10 code, you say it's ICD-10, right? And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever. And like the issue with like a custom data dictionary is you don't have, and you really don't necessarily need like a custom, a standardized, internationally like vetoed body of terminology around each one of these things. Mostly because you don't need that sort of comparability around every single field like you do in clinical cases. Because a lot of them are maybe derived from politics. So, in a way, you're asking a community of practice like ourselves, countries, regional groups, WHO, to say, instead of ICD-10, there's a something, and there's a something, there's an ICD, right? And there's a version, and then inside that version, there's a code. And I think the first thing we should find out from the terminology services people is what does that identifier look like? And is it related to a particular server or service of the terminology database? And if they have any best practice around that existing, right? But we can assume in the end it's like kind of a string, like a complicated string. So that way, at least we can start saying, oh, look, in this facility registry, we have this list of districts, this list of colors, this list of facility types, and at least we can know if it's the same one that you have over here. So that's, I think, one question, Scott, that we need to ask. But I think it's safer to assume there's a string of some sorts that we can do, that we can use for that. And then let's look. I don't know. Does anybody else have something to comment? I don't know if folks in Measure, if you, Clara, or Mark, you want to share any experience in the space.
I don't really have anything to share. So maybe Clara.
Yeah. Nice. So that's kind of like
nothing to share.
Okay, so that's the first step, is identifying what is the code set that you're using. And then if we look at the stories, we focus on one particular path, right, through all this topic, which is synchronizing admin hierarchy. And another aspect of the story is to make sure that both sides of the data dictionary understand the same types, right? I mean, there's things like lists, and there's semantics with the lists. It could be multi-select, single-select, a hierarchy, a single-select hierarchy. And if you want to hopefully be able to share a tree of things from one side to an updated tree of things on the other side, which is kind of our scenario goal, you have to believe that both sides have a common agreement about what a tree of things means, right, or what a list means. So that is another aspect, that the semantics are needed. For example, when you share an ICD-10 code for some, let's say, LOINC codes for some questions, you know that this sort of question is linked to 3 potential answers. Like do they have a fever? It's yes, no, not measured, or whatever. I don't know what the standard ones are, but it's predetermined as part of ICD, right? And ICD understands that a question can have one of multiple answers. That notion of one question with a choice of one of n is implicit. And if we're hoping to synchronize with a data dictionary, what you don't want to have happen is that the data dictionary in the terminology service says a facility type could be a multiple selection of any of this list, because you could maybe be a lab and a hospital and an ophthalmologist, right, or whatever, and maybe the other side takes a list and thinks it should be only one of. So you can either be a lab or an ophthalmologist or a hospital. And so there has to be some basic understanding. And what we should do, I think, to solve this is to find like one or two very pragmatic types of things that are commonly missynced and stick to that. And my gut says it's probably hierarchies, trees of things, and lists, in which the list could be multi-select and or single select sort of thing. Do you guys agree with that? Is like something that needs to be an understanding, and do you think that there's types that should be added into this candidate list?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. But how would you sort of, because if you want to synchronize that stuff, that seems really hard. If something is a lab in one system, it could be a hospital somewhere else. Then the facility register would have to know about all these things, else it would be impossible to sort of feed all those systems out of one place.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to a very important question about scope. I mean, it's one thing to know that your data that there's new options for your data dictionary. Another thing altogether is to manage the migration of movement of data through time as those data dictionary changes. And I think we should explicitly scope out that second section, saying, look, if in 2014 you had 3 colors of facilities, red, blue, green, and in 2015 you're adding purple as a facility color, maybe some of the old blue ones need to be recoded as purple. That's a problem of the domain. I think we're just trying to get to the point where you could get that list of 3 colors to be said, this is the old one, this is the new one. Somebody needs to do something here.
Right.
Or even just say, hey, this is the old version and this is the new one, and you need to start filling this one in. I think each system that consumes information from the terminology service, like a facility registry, needs to decide in its own domain what it means to help users with that data migration. But I don't think it's in scope to kind of say, oh, here's like an automatic rules and mappings and whatnots, that go with that. At least not in this stage. I mean, if you don't have the steps that we're talking about first, there's no hope of doing that thing later. So we'll burn that bridge when we get to it, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, because otherwise, you know how it is. Like somebody changes your data dictionary. In data warehousing, it's very well known as the problem of like drifting dimensions, right? And then your dimensions differ from the old ones, and what does it mean? Yeah, so that's. And I guess we're all smiling because we know that sucks. And Clara, how long have you been working with Measure and all that stuff?
Sorry, I've been on the Demographic and Health Survey project for about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked on the Kenya Master Facility List activity.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're working on kind of a larger facility list. But my focus typically is on the geographic side, so the geocodes and some of the data harmonization piece.
Right. So as far as data, you know what we're talking about when we say like data harmonization and the drifting dimensions problem. I'm sure maybe your list of facilities grows slower than the changes to the hierarchies themselves in Kenya or something.
Yeah.
If you want to share with you some of the challenges you ran into, that might be a fun thing to consider.
Sure. I mean, I think some of it's less the changing codes so much as just people having different definitions of the codes often. So just the standards and that sort of thing.
So what do you really mean by ophthalmologist sort of question? Like just like in clinical problems, like what do you really mean by fever? Fever taken by the back of your hand, or fever taken under the armpit, or fever, that sort of
meaning? So
on
the list, typically it's services and there's a predetermination, but it's that process of determining what exactly is being defined that is kind of the issue often. I mean, within the surveys that we do, I mean, all of that is sort of been standardized over time. So within the facility level surveys, there's a whole process of determining the questionnaires and all that stuff that's pretty standardized.
Okay. And has there been any changes kind of in the data dictionaries that you've had to propagate between systems over those 5 years that you remember fondly?
So thankfully, I don't get to deal with like the systems as much. At the country level, I think there has been some of that. You know, when we are so underneath the hood, kind of analyzing data or comparing some of our survey level data sets, then certainly, yeah, there's issues of harmonization and changes in codes over time, but not as drastic as you might imagine. So.
Mm-hmm. And the mapping in the end it gets resolved manually. Like, let's say somebody adds a new facility type. I mean, I'm using that, maybe it's a bad example, but like as somebody adds a facility type or somebody adds a new, some other classifier, or even changes the admin hierarchy, and somebody has to go and curate manually all that stuff, right?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, there's some ways that we've tried to automate it, but I mean, an example would be actually in Kenya last year. They did a full facility survey, the Serum survey, which also collected geocodes. Separately, we had geocodes already in the master facility list, some of which were valid, some of which had been gazetted to the nearest town or something like that. And then had to go through the process of trying to validate both data sets and then the data sets together. While at the same time in Kenya, they can't quite get their act together to sort out their administrative levels and where the administrative locations are. So just trying to then validate the data against existing geographic components was a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
and
I would say
then you go with having to do it manually ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Then listening to that, I would say let's add, Scott, to the types of things that are in sync besides the lists and the hierarchies. Like an understanding of the semantics of the geocodes is also something I've seen, and maybe Clara you've seen as well, where sometimes you get a lat long, but is the lat long of the town that's being gazetted closest to the facility, so you end up with two numbers that you think are an actual lat long of the facility, but it's just because somebody has not, it's gone through a chain of interpretation that you end up with the lat long of the town, of the centroid, right, and not of the facility itself. But nobody took care of distinguishing that clearly in the data dictionary, so you end up with mixed up geocodes. And I'm sure, Scott, you've seen those examples of stuff in our, as you've been collecting lots of health facility registries around the world.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times it gets lost too, because if you're not presenting the level of specificity that geo point is, people will just start assuming, oh, it is the building location as opposed to the center of the town or. I think it just kind of gets washed in, when that data is actually shared out to, broader, groups of stakeholders and things like that. So, because I'm sure in Tanzania, they've kind of cobbled together GPS data from a couple different locations. And I'm sure that metadata hasn't always come along with all that as well as it should. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There's the aid data group through the Development Gateway has put together some interesting standards about how to geocode things and how you might mark the level of accuracy. Though, as Scott said, that doesn't always follow, though in a lot of cases it doesn't matter. It just depends on what you're using the data for ultimately. But for the vast majority of stakeholders, in most cases, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And we had that document. I remember seeing it, and we were discussing how you would implement it in the in resource map at least, because we needed to make sure that you could implement those location types. And I think they had a level system where it's the best is GPS coordinates of the actual facility taken to so many decimal places or precision, and then all the way out to the district name. And stuff like
totally.
that. But I'm glad to have that there, because what happens, like sometimes you get a data set and it's like, oh look, all these facilities are together. It's like, no, they're all located at the lat long of the centroid of the district, and I can assure you there's not 100 health facilities all like plumped right there, because you can see it in the satellite. It's like a forest.
Yeah.
Okay. So and if Clara, if you know of any good documents that describe that, that's a good example, because we want to make sure that in the terminology service, they can like define, let's say, a location field with certain like characteristics, such that then in a facility registry you can say that's the version of the dictionary I'm using, right? So if there's any additional documents that you like or you think should be seen to be that standard, let's use them as examples.
Okay, yeah, I'll look for some things. I think both in the Kenya implementation guide as well as the AData, there is some description of those fields that might be helpful.
Yeah, that's where I think we saw it in the Kenya document, right? The one that Jason had done?
Yeah, I definitely remember that one. So yeah, well, I'll take a note here, and we can go back and kind of maybe pull some of that detail for, how we want to specify the workflow and the requirements. So.
Okay. Well.
All right.
So Scott, to solve these user stories, are we going to use like an example data set or scenario, maybe the Tanzanian one or something you recommend?
I mean, we could do that, or if I don't know if there's a measure example you guys would want to use or another DHIS one. I think Tanzania is good because we have pretty clear need there to resolve it, and they're interested in implementing a terminology service. So it could be. I think using them as an example would be a nice use case, but. I don't know, do others on the call have anything they would like to see, be considered as an example too?
Not really, no. I don't know.
Mark, you don't have any data sets sitting around that you would needed to work this with? All right.
No, not really, no.
Okay.
Not that I know of, maybe. I don't know.
Well, think about it. Larry, how about on your end with the sandbox? Does Tanzania sound okay for to use as an example here?
Yeah, that sounds good. It's really up to someone who is familiar with the concepts and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We don't feel we would be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, I mean, they have Tanzania has like a pretty robust data specification that they drafted, and the nice thing is that there's an implementation of that facility registry already ready that we could take and use as demo data for this process. So,
Mm-hmm.
All right, Ed. Yeah, why don't we plan on doing that? Then using the Tanzania example, and I'm sure Neve will be excited when she joins that she's been chosen as the volunteer.
Yep. And I would suggest that unless we have something specific, I mean, we're not like the first people on the planet who have had to sync a list and a hierarchy for a data dictionary.
Yep.
Pretty nice things that are maturing to do it in web-friendly ways. So I would suggest looking at, and including the geo aspects, I would suggest looking at the Oasis OData Spec, CSDL, just to be at least inspired or reusing how they define some of these things. Oasis is a big spec to digest. I'm not saying that everything should be like OData based, but they have to describe their metadata. Oops. Oh, you invoked her.
I have that power now.
Yeah, Scott said, I'm sure when Neve hears this, she'll be really happy. And here's Neve.
She should be joining here in a second. Sometimes it takes a second to process.
Yeah.
Hey, Neve, how are you doing? Oh, you're on mute, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
Gotta get the headset. A key requirement for Hangouts these days. Well, Neve, just to give you a little update, I bet you can hear us. We were just talking about you because we were thinking about using the Tanzania Facility Registry as like an instance to manipulate some demo data from. and the data spec specifically to use as an example for the workflow, if that sounds appealing to you. Oh, we still can't hear you. I think you're still in mute. Oh, there we go. Good.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize the default setting on the highlight was mute. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'll just have to, get approval from Solder, but I don't really see an issue with that.
Sure, yeah.
They know this is going to benefit them, so.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even need to use the real data. We'll just use your spec and just create demo data from that and kind of scramble things. So, okay, cool. All right, Ed. So where do we go from here? You were mentioning something about the Oasis data spec, and then we also, have some details about the geocode metadata that we might want to consider in this as well.
Yeah, I added something in the notes there. Oasis has a CSDL language. So, Oasis is the standards body. There's a standard for exposing data in RESTful approaches on the web called OData. OData has a dark origin close to Microsoft, and in the beginning everybody was like, ugh, that sucks. But over time, the only kind of viable alternative to that was GData from Google, and Google decided to stop mucking around with standards for data, and each application ends up having its own kind of data spec. But then Oasis started looking at OData as an inspiration, and somehow, I think because of new management and stuff, they befriended the folks at Microsoft that were working on the spec, and now it's become more of a web industry starting point for large systems that do a lot of data integration. For example, if you've heard about Salesforce, the large online CRM, they use OData as a default way to expose all their information to other systems. So there's a lot of the enterprise needs that were originally solved in the intranet, with data warehouses and metadata dictionaries and things like that, that was unrelated to the world of web interoperability, all those needs are now starting to be observed in the open internet. And these the specs and the standards have evolved over the last years to get there. So I think this is an important place to look at for inspiration. And especially because they've had to deal already with things like geo and lists. I didn't find a quick scan how they deal with hierarchies, but instead of inventing our own way to determine a data type, I'd rather just say just like ICD-10 exists and you can say that's that, I would rather say this is OData list, and it's the semantics of what needs to be an OData list are documented by other people who have full-time jobs and salaries maintaining that. Seems like a reasonable starting point strategy. And with the benefits that it can be used as a building block for things that we might want to take to OHIE, to HIE. If IHE, all those acronyms, to IHE if we wanted to do profiles, and with the benefit that these are done by Oasis, and at least I have contacts there that they might be excited to know that their specs are not just being used by large enterprises, but are being used for these sort of humanitarian and social purposes. So I think it's something to be looking at, and inside that spec, there's a lot of information about how to exchange data. But as part of knowing how to exchange data, you also have to have an ability to exchange data types and dictionaries. And CSDL is a subset of the spec that says, here's how you describe your things. My thing has a color, my thing has a geographic location, my thing has a reference to a geographic polygon, my thing belongs to a list, things like that. So I'm going to just link it here for those who are inclined to look at it. Suspecting Mark and Clara might be interested, and Larry, you might as well. Neve, it's a bit like a drab. I don't recommend it unless you're having some problem with jet lag. But you have a systems background, so you'll appreciate the sort of issues that they've had to deal with.
Okay.
So, I'm going to just leave the link there. And so now that we say we're going to identify on some types, and the candidate types are lists, hierarchies, and geopoints, and now what we have to do is agree on a way to expose those types in terminology service, at least to compare whether what you're doing in the facility registry as an example system is different than what's going on in the terminology service. Like at least comparing those versions, saying, oh, look, you have a new hierarchy of admin zones, or oh, look, you have a new list of facility types, or oh, you have a new way to code position as well. And that needs to be exposed somehow. So that means that the terminology service system has to have some sort of API to discover changes to these data types. Hey, I have list of facilities version, facility types version 2014, and now, oh, that's being subsumed by 2015. So, we ask that question of the terminology service, I imagine, and then if the question comes up, there is something new, there is a difference, then that opens up the final step, which is how do we bring that in?
Hey, Carl, welcome to the call. How are you doing? Carl, can you hear us okay?
Hey, yeah, I can.
Okay, cool, man. Hey, welcome.
Sorry to join late, something came up.
Yeah, no worries. We have a bit of a group notes pad going on in the Google Docs on the left if you want to take a look.
I'm trying to, as you were reading, Carl, hey, Carl, I was trying to write up what we just mentioned. And it's interesting because I think when we talk about how you synchronize these things, a lot of people start, I think, in these steps in step 5, or maybe even what would be a step 6. But all the other ones are really, really important to set that one for success. If I'm saying here's a list of facilities, but we don't agree what a list means and we don't agree what the semantics of a list is, then you're just kicking the problem further down the pipe. You're not really solving it. So I'm going to just number this list because it's there you go. It's better as numbers. Okay. Does this story of steps start resonating with people about what are the detailed sequence of things that need to happen in order to get that hierarchy, that list of facility types, the dictionary of geopoints from a master terminology service into a system like the facility registry? Is there anything that we're missing? Because this will start informing what our actors are and what the high-level conversations are, and then it will be really simple from there to go to a sequence diagram. And
I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing just to note, with the administrative hierarchies, I see you have Team Morales here. What we've been doing is we've also been putting them as organizations in CSD, where we have, and putting the facilities at the various organizational level. So it's not quite a terminology, but it's very similar. I just wanted to, and I also talked to Jack about how to represent that as a terminology as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think at the implementation, there's many ways that people have been having to do this, right? And there's ways that you can piggyback things to get it done. And the example of the admin hierarchy is not as much because we're trying to sync an admin hierarchy. It's more like an example of a hierarchy type that if gets maintained in one site, but those changes are not propagated to other places, then both the updates and interpretation of data is at risk. So the admin hierarchy is being the ever-present example, but it could be any hierarchy. I think in Neve Scott in Tanzania, actually a lot of the services are coded as hierarchies as well, right? Or they used to, maybe.
I think there's a couple of fields facility type, I think, is actually a hierarchy where there's a hospital and then subtypes of hospitals. I think services, we ended up doing multi-select fields, kind of like a number of multi-select fields is what was settled on.
And the ownership, Scott, as well, is a hierarchy, right, with the public and then sub-levels and private and sub-levels.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's a good example that there's all kinds of different ways that somebody might want to use a hierarchy to code the metadata around certain fields that they have.
Mm-hmm. No. Okay.
Claire, I'm a little curious. Do you guys ever use hierarchical fields in your surveys, or how do you typically, like in Kenya or other places, might use those?
Other field, right? I think is what's it.
So yes, but we actually use a data entry form that's called CS Pro, and it allows for hierarchical structure.
Okay, cool. So you might have some similar kind of examples of hierarchical fields as well.
Yeah, but it's mostly in our household surveys, less so in the facility-based surveys, I believe.
Oh, okay, cool. Cool. All right. Well, so if we have a rough agreement on the steps and way forward, I suppose the next step would be to start to draft some of those things, unless anybody has any other initial questions or thoughts or concerns.
Well, I think it's a very strong point to start picking from like the terminology services guys. What are the ways to version code sets, like how to identify them unequivocally with what it is and what version it is. Mm-hmm. Then we've, I think, come up with 3 candidate types, of which lists and geo are very important and well understood, and hierarchies is also important and probably well understood. And then we have to agree on a way to have that exposed by a terminology services, both in terms of metadata and content. Metadata being there's a new version of the list of facility types, and it's a multi-select list, and then the content being here's actual types of facilities, ophthalmologist, hospital, etc. For the latter, there's probably some standards that we can use, and for the former, probably as well, but it's just like a little piece of information. So there should be like an overload of standards for number 4. So I think from here we can sketch up like a profile using all these standards that would be at least viable in arm wave land, and then we can start actually pressure testing it around Tanzania's data dictionaries, and start saying, okay, terminology services guys, here's the list of facility types, the hierarchy. Sorry, put that into your thing. Can you expose it this way? Yes, no, why not? What haven't we thought about? And actually start like threading it through in concrete terms.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting, I think, as a problem to manage. Actually, when we started doing resource map way before OHIE existed, it was one of the things that we envisioned people would start doing, is like sharing like subsets of forms and so on. And there's obviously like different ways of doing that, but it's one thing to share a point in time thing. It's another thing to have an ongoing link or kind of keep yourself beholden to a data dictionary that's maintained elsewhere, where they do their changes in their times, and then you have to do your data migration in your time. It ups a couple of notches in the complexity, but it's not insurmountable. Mm-hmm. And we're not focusing on how to migrate the data from semantics A to semantics B. We're just trying to get to the point where it wasn't semantics A. We know that there's a semantics B. The semantics B is inside the tool, and then humans, algorithms, whatever, can help do that transition or keep things in parallel.
Neef, I'd be curious to hear if there's anything kind of in addition to that scope that Ed was describing that you feel like is a strong need in Tanzania.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind immediately. Those, I think, address the main areas that we have in Tanzania.
Hmm. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about Tanzania? Are you just working with Team Morales and the Ministry of Health, or are you also working with CSSC?
We're working with the multiple stakeholders, and PM Morales is one of them, and the Ministry of Health, and then worked with various other National Health Insurance Fund and National Bureau of Statistics. because obviously the National Bureau of Statistics is more focused on the survey. So at one level of the hierarchy, they diverge from how the ministry would look at the hierarchy.
Okay.
So we're looking at, getting down to the regions, district, sub-district, ward, village, and whereas the National Bureau of Statistics, they may get down to the ward level and then go into enumeration areas. But they're not so relevant right now for the facilities. But yeah, I mean, there will be multiple parallel hierarchies in every country because there will be, different needs for grouping information together in different ways. But I think the main areas for us are the hierarchy, as you mentioned, the list, the geographic, we're using hierarchies in many different areas, not just the geographic, but again in services and stuff. And then the integration between the Health Facility Registry and the Human Resources Registry, which would be separate from, I think, this discussion. But would build on that.
A good one to keep in mind.
Just a quick comment. So the CSSC, that's the space sector umbrella organization, and they don't do regions, they do zones, but then they go down to districts. So it's it overlaps largely with the.
We do use zones in the current Health Facility Registry. One of the challenge with the zones is it's not a administrative hierarchy. It's more of a hierarchy that's been used by different ministries to group functions together. So the Ministry of Land may have slightly different regions that are in their zones than the Ministry of Health does. Right. So there are multiple, some ministries have 6 zones, some have 8 zones. So there's a little bit of difference around that, but right now the hierarchy reflects the agreed upon Ministry of Health kind of PMO-RALG approach to zones in the health sector.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you go into education or into other sectors, there can be different grouping of regions into zones, but we haven't gone down that path. We've just had agreement between PMO-RALG and Ministry of Health and kind of National Bureau of Statistics.
Yeah. Neve, one other thing that we were chatting about a bit before, just right before you joined, Claire brought up was like the level of specificity associated with a GPS coordinate. Is a GPS coordinate, located like on the building that the facility is in, or is it, approximated to a village or even maybe a division or something? And so I just thought I would mention this before we kind of run out of time today, but that might be another thing we want to consider in this, being able to include the metadata associated with how specific a geolocation point is. Because
I think that's a really excellent point, Scott, because I think we're finding in Tanzania their interpretation, a lot of the users are, you're going to give me the exact location of the main entrance into the facility with your geocode. And of course, because they're being taken by different people in different areas, we're getting inconsistent approach. So I think having that level of specificity available would be really helpful. So then you could either use different, GUI icons or whatever to show what your, what the geocodes are really meaning.
Yeah, and have that, be able to store that detail along with your GPS coordinates so that is this an approximation or is it like on the building itself? And so okay, cool. Good to hear that would also be helpful in Tanzania. I think that's an important one for us to consider along with the spec here. So all right, guys. So we have about 9 minutes left. I want to say any last questions or things to cover today or thoughts anyone wants to share. All right, so I think we have a number of next steps here. One thing I wanted to mention is we do have the holidays coming up here. I believe this will be our last community, let me just double check the calendar here real quick, but our last community meeting for Christmas, so we'll probably reconvene after the new year. And another thing I wanted to mention too is that I'm going to be out on paternity leave during the month of January. But between Ed and some of our other colleagues at Instead, we will continue to have these calls and push this kind of agenda item in our community too. But just wanted to mention that to everybody and just keep you up to date on that.
Yeah, and I have to say, Scott's been doing a fantastic job of wearing like the 2 dozen hats the OHIE Facility Registry project needs, in both in terms of implementation, support, discovery of ongoing projects in the world, managing community, all the internal reporting and things that OHIE needs. So Scott and I are going to work on like a more structured way to send out to you if you need things from us, how to deal with the team in the meantime. But we're going to encapsulate that as much as possible. But he's leaving large shoes to fill in the meantime. So, but he'll be back. Sleep deprived and happier than ever. So we're looking forward to it.
Sleep deprived, yeah.
Yeah, probably a few new wrinkles and maybe some more gray hair or something. But I'll be back.
Yeah, but a big smile, I'm sure.
And a little baby.
That's right.
So, anyways, cool guys. Well, but yeah, so 2 weeks from today is actually Christmas. So this will be our last call, before the holidays, and just wanted to wish everybody happy holidays, and hope everyone gets to get some rest in after a busy year here. And but yeah, any other closing thoughts or questions before we wrap up for today?
No.
All right.
We need a terminology services person.
We'll get Jack Bowie back in
for the next one. This one was more about the shaping the problem, and then we'll start shaping the solution. And the final thing, Scott, is you and I better work before you go off on paternity leave to like have some concrete examples from the Tanzania data sets that we'll use as litmus tests to this workflow.
I'll pull from so we have the existing data set, and then I'll do a bit of like scramble randomization removal of any sensitive details, and then Neve, I'll copy you on that just between you, me, and Ed, and we can use that as like an initial demo set. But it'll be totally randomized, anonymized, all that.
Because then everybody can contribute. Terminology services guys can say this is what we can do with this. Carl can say this is what we had to do, what we would have to do in CSD to work with this, and it kind of enables everybody when it's concrete. So thank you.
Okay.
Good. Great.
Fantastic.
Hey.
Awesome.
All right, thanks everybody.
I hope everybody has a nice Christmas. Bye.
You too. Take care, everyone.
All right, bye.